One of the plants on this list was tested against a prescription sleep medication in a clinical trial, not compared on paper, tested, head to head, and it held its own. Another one has been used for sleep by indigenous peoples of the American Southeast for centuries, and the moment European settlers encountered it, they adopted it for exactly the same purpose. No convincing required. And one of them, number 9, has a name that makes people back away immediately because it sounds like something dangerous. It isn't. And once I explain what it actually is, most people wish they'd known sooner. 15 plants, most of them growing right now within 30 feet of wherever you're sitting. Some of them you've been pulling out of your garden for years. In 20 years as a registered nurse, the thing I kept seeing wasn't a vitamin deficiency. It wasn't a disease. It was people who hadn't slept properly in years and had no idea what that was doing to the rest of them. Bad sleep doesn't announce itself. It just shows up quietly, in blood pressure, in mood, in how sharp your thinking is by Thursday afternoon. I watched it happen, over and over, until I left the ward and started paying serious attention to this garden. What I found out here surprised me, not because the plants were exotic or hard to find, because most of them were already here. I'm Clara. I'll say this once. Nothing here replaces your doctor, but if your sleep has been off and you've never thought to look at what's already growing around you, stay with me. 15 teas, what the research actually says, what 2,000 years of use says, and we start with the one most people already have in their kitchen and almost never use for this. Chamomile. It's probably sitting in your cabinet right now, in a little paper box you've never given much thought to. Well, it deserves more credit than that. People have been drinking this flower for sleep since before written history settled into anything we'd call medicine. The ancient Egyptians valued it highly, and its use appears in their medical papyri. The Greeks and Romans drank it for nerves and for fever alike, and its very name comes from the Greek for ground apple, on account of the way the fresh flowers smell when you brush past them. Medieval European households grew it along garden walkways for that very reason, so the scent would rise every time someone walked over it. It was strewn on floors too, back before anyone had proper flooring to speak of, mixed in with rushes to keep a room smelling clean and, they believed, to keep the household calm besides. Here's the part that always surprised my patients. Chamomile contains a compound called apigenin. Don't let that word scare you off. Think of it like a key that fits a very particular lock in your brain, the same lock that quiets down a racing mind at the end of a long day. Research suggests apigenin binds to certain calming receptors in the brain, the same general family that some prescription sedatives work on, just far gentler and far slower to act. That's not me promising you this fixes insomnia outright. It's what the evidence so far indicates. One clinical trial followed nursing home residents drinking chamomile tea nightly over a period of weeks and found a meaningful improvement in reported sleep quality compared to those who didn't. Modest, not dramatic, but real enough that researchers keep circling back to this humble little flower decade after decade. Chamomile's got a cousin worth mentioning, by the way. German chamomile, the kind most of us drink, and Roman chamomile, which is used more in aromatherapy than in a cup. They're not interchangeable, and if you're buying dried flowers, it's worth knowing which one's in the bag. I stick with German chamomile myself. It's the one behind nearly all the research you'll find. I steep mine simple, a heaping teaspoon of the dried flower heads, hot water just off the boil, covered for 8 to 10 minutes so the good part doesn't float off with the steam. Covered. That's the part folks forget. If you're pregnant, nursing, or on blood thinners, have a word with your doctor before you make this a nightly habit. Chamomile's gentle, but gentle doesn't mean it's right for everybody. Lemon balm has this bright, citrusy smell that doesn't seem like it belongs in a sleep conversation at all. But medieval monks grew whole gardens of it for exactly that purpose. They called a version of it Carmelite water, and they drank it for nerves, for digestion, and for what they simply described as a troubled mind. Funny how the old language for anxiety was so much more honest than ours. Even the great herbalist Paracelsus, back in the 1500s, called it the elixir of life, which is a bold claim for a plant that mostly just grows like it wants to take over your whole garden bed. Beekeepers have always had a soft spot for it too. The very name Melissa comes from the Greek word for honeybee, since bees are drawn to the blossoms something fierce. There's a nice symmetry in that. A plant that calms the person drinking it and feeds the very creatures that help everything else in the garden along. Lemon balm carries a compound called rosmarinic acid, and here's the simple way I think about it. Your brain has a little cleanup crew that breaks down your calming signals a bit too fast when you're stressed. Rosmarinic acid seems to slow that cleanup crew down, so the calm sticks around longer instead of getting swept away the moment it shows up. There's something else lemon balm's been studied for that surprises people: mild digestive upset tied to nervousness, the kind of stomach flutter you get before something stressful. The same easing effect on the nervous system seems to carry over to the gut, which our grandmothers could probably have told us without a single study to back it up. Small trials pairing lemon balm with other nerving herbs have shown real improvements in sleep quality, though researchers are honest that lemon balm on its own has less evidence behind it than some of the plants further down this list. That's partly why you'll see it turn up again and again as a mixer. It plays well with others. I pair it with Skullcap more nights than not, which we'll get to shortly. I like mine fresh when I've got it. Corn leaves right into the cup. Hot water. 5 minutes covered. Dried works nearly as well. Just give it a minute or two longer. The flavor is light enough that even folks who don't normally enjoy herbal tea tend to find lemon balm agreeable, which is part of why it makes such a good entry point into all of this. Bright, simple, honest. Here's the one I mentioned earlier, Passionflower. Indigenous peoples across the American Southeast used this vine long before European settlers ever set foot on the continent, brewing it for restlessness and for nerves worn thin. Spanish missionaries later gave it its name, seeing the crown-shaped flower and reading the Passion of Christ into its petals. Whether or not you see that symbolism yourself, it's a striking bloom to find growing wild along a fence line, and I've always thought it was fitting that something so calming to drink is also just about the showiest flower in this entire lineup. Once European explorers encountered the vine, it crossed the Atlantic and was adopted into European herbal medicine by the 1800s, where it was welcomed as a gentler nerve remedy. The fact that a plant already trusted by indigenous peoples for sleep made sense to European herbalists the moment they tried it. That kind of independent recognition is worth paying attention to. Passionflower works, as best researchers can tell, by slowing down the brain's own cleanup process, the little mechanism that breaks apart its calming signal, GABA, a bit too quickly. Think of GABA as the brake pedal for your nervous system. Passionflower doesn't slam the brake down. It just keeps the brake from releasing quite as fast as it normally would. A handful of small clinical trials have compared passionflower tea to standard approaches for mild anxiety-related sleeplessness, and the results were encouraging enough that researchers keep coming back to study it further, particularly for people whose sleeplessness seems tangled up with a busy, circling mind rather than physical restlessness. That's a distinction worth sitting with for a moment. Not all sleeplessness comes from the same place. Some of it's a body that won't settle. Some of it's a mind that won't stop turning over the day's leftover worries. Passionflower seems to lean toward helping with the second kind more than the first. A teaspoon of the dried herb, steeped 10 minutes, covered. It's got a mild, grassy taste. I usually add a bit of honey from my neighbor's hives. The whole plant above the roots is used, leaf, stem, and flower together, and some traditional preparations included a small amount of root as well, though most modern sources stick to the aerial parts for everyday use. Neighborly. That's half of what herbalism's always been about, if you ask me. Skullcap gets its name from the shape of its little blue flower, which looks something like an old soldier's cap, if you squint. Native American healers across several nations used this plant as what herbalists still call a nervine, meaning it was reached for specifically to settle a nervous system that wouldn't settle itself on its own. It made its way into American folk medicine cabinets by the 1800s, sitting right alongside Valerian on the shelf, and physicians of that era sometimes prescribed it under the name Scutellaria, borrowed straight from its Latin genus. It even picked up the nickname Mad Dog Skullcap in the 1800s, when it was marketed as a remedy for rabies, a claim that didn't survive contact with reality and was quietly dropped. The plant itself never changed. What changed was how honestly people spoke about what it could actually do. The compound getting the most attention here is called bicolin. In plain terms, it appears to support the same calming receptor system that chamomile's apigenin works on, just through a slightly different door. I want to be honest with you. Skullcap has less large-scale human research behind it than chamomile or valerian. What we have is mostly traditional use, backed by smaller modern studies looking at anxiety and nervous tension specifically. That doesn't make it useless. It means we hold the claim loosely, the way any honest person should. Interestingly, some of the more recent laboratory work has looked at Skullcap's effect on inflammation in the nervous system generally, not sleep specifically, and the early findings there are part of why interest in this plant has picked back up after a long, quiet stretch. One thing worth knowing, there's an old mix-up in some herb shops between American Skullcap and a different plant sold under a similar name that's been linked to liver concerns. Buy from a source that identifies the plant properly, by its Latin name, Scutellaria lateriflora. It matters more than people realize. A teaspoon of dried leaf and flower, steeped covered for 10 minutes. Earthy, a little bitter. I usually pair it with a splash of lemon balm to soften that up. Simple combinations, most nights. That's really all this is. Lavender. Most folks know it from a candle or a pillow spray. Fewer know you can drink it. Romans scented their bathwater with it. The name itself comes from the Latin word for washing, but long before it was about fragrance, it was about calm, tucked under pillows across Europe for centuries, precisely because it seemed to ease people into rest, and dried into little sachets that mothers tucked into their children's linens for generations. My own mother did the same with mine, though whether that habit came from her or from her mother before her, I honestly couldn't tell you anymore. Most of the modern research on lavender for sleep actually looks at the oil, taken in a specific capsule form, or simply breathed in through diffused scent. The tea version has less formal research behind it directly, though the calming aromatic compounds, linalool and linaloyl acetate, are still present in the dried flower, just in gentler concentration. So I'll be straight with you here. Lavender tea is more about the ritual and the aroma working alongside whatever mild calming effect the compounds provide, not a heavily studied standalone sleep remedy, the way some others on this list are. That said, one small trial that did look at lavender tea specifically found participants fell asleep somewhat faster and rated their sleep as deeper on subjective questionnaires, which is encouraging, even if it's a smaller body of evidence than we'd like. Culinary lavender, the kind sold for baking, is the same plant you want for tea. Skip anything labeled for potpourri or crafts. Those are often treated with fragrance additives that have no business anywhere near a teacup. A teaspoon of dried buds, steeped covered for 5 to 7 minutes, no longer, or it turns bitter fast. A small splash of raw honey balances it well, and some people like a thin slice of lemon alongside, which actually pulls out the aromatic compounds a little more fully. I drink mine on the porch most evenings, when the weather allows. That's not science. That's just a nice way to end a day. Valerian's got an odd reputation. Folks either love the smell or they can't stand it. It's earthy, a little like a damp basement, if I'm honest. Hippocrates himself wrote about it, back in ancient Greece. So did physicians in World War II Britain, who reportedly used it to help civilians cope with the stress of the bombing raids when nerves across the country were stretched about as thin as they could go. Even earlier than that, Valerian carried the nickname All Heal in some parts of medieval Europe, a title it never quite earned in the literal sense, but one that speaks to just how broadly it was reached for, from nervous tension to headaches to the aftermath of a bad shock. Long before anyone could explain the chemistry, people trusted the root because it kept working, cup after cup, generation after generation. Here's the trial I mentioned. A small clinical study measured valerian root against a standard prescription sedative for people with sleep difficulty and found the two performed comparably on several measures. One study, not a mountain of proof, but it's the kind of finding that keeps researchers paying attention to this root, decade after decade. The way it seems to work is by slowing down how quickly your brain breaks apart its own calming signal, GABA, so more of it lingers where it's needed. Other reviews pooling several smaller Valerian trials together have found a modest, consistent improvement in sleep quality overall, even where individual studies varied quite a bit in size and design. That's usually a good sign in herbal research. When the effect shows up again and again across different groups of researchers, it's less likely to be a fluke. It's worth knowing Valerian doesn't work the same for everybody. Some people feel calm and drowsy within the hour. A smaller number feel oddly wired, almost the opposite effect. Nobody's entirely sure why, though some researchers suspect it has to do with how a person's own body processes the valerianic acid. If it doesn't agree with you, it's not a failure on your part. It's just not your plant. I need to stop and be direct with you here, because this one matters. Valerian can intensify the effect of sedatives, sleep medications, and alcohol. If you're taking anything for anxiety, depression, or sleep already, or if you're scheduled for surgery, talk to your doctor before adding this root to your evening routine. This isn't a suggestion I'm making lightly. A teaspoon of dried root, simmered gently for 10 minutes rather than just steeped. It's a tougher plant. It needs the heat a bit longer. Hops. Yes, the same plant that flavors your beer. Long before brewers cared about bitterness and aroma, hop pickers noticed something odd. Workers harvesting the cones by hand, hour after hour, would grow drowsy on the job, well before they'd had a drop to drink. Some accounts from English hop yards even describe pickers falling asleep mid-shift, propped up against the bines. That observation is where a lot of the herbal use of hops for sleep actually started, long before anyone isolated a single compound to explain it. By the 16th century, European herbalists had already connected the dots and were recommending hop tea specifically for restlessness, decades before germ theory or receptor biology gave anyone the language to explain why it worked. Sometimes the old-timers get to the right answer a very long way ahead of the science that eventually catches up to them. The compound doing the work is methylbutanol, released as the cone dries and oxidizes a bit, which is part of why fresh hops smell green and sharp, while dried hops smell heavier, almost musky. It appears to act on several calming systems in the brain at once, the GABA system, and some evidence suggests the adenosine system too, which is the same one caffeine works on, just in the opposite direction. Hops rarely gets used alone anymore. Most of the modern research studies it paired with valerian, and several small trials of that combination showed real improvement in how quickly people fell asleep and how well they stayed there through the night. There's even a curious old bit of American folk practice worth mentioning. Pillows stuffed with dried hops, given to folks who couldn't sleep, well before anyone thought to brew the cones into tea at all. The scent alone was considered enough to help. A small pinch of dried cone, less than you'd think, steeped covered for 5 minutes. It's got a bitter, almost bready flavor. Honestly, I mix mine with lemon balm most nights, or it's a bit much on its own. Bitter, but effective, from what the research and my own kettle both tell me. Magnolia bark isn't something you'll find in most Western gardens, but it's been a fixture of traditional Chinese medicine for well over 1,000 years, where it's known as ho po. It wasn't originally used just for sleep. Practitioners reached for it to settle what they described as a restless, uneasy stomach paired with a restless mind. In a way, this bark isn't just a remedy for one thing. It's a reminder that a nervous stomach and a nervous mind were never really two separate problems to begin with, no matter how modern medicine likes to file them apart. Classical Chinese medical texts group magnolia bark among what they called the key regulating herbs, meaning it was understood to work on the flow of the whole system rather than one isolated symptom. It's a different way of thinking about health than most of us grew up with, and I'll admit it took me years of gardening and reading before that framework started to make real sense to me. 2 compounds in the bark, honokiol and magnolol, are the ones researchers keep circling back to. In simple terms, they seem to support the same calming receptor doorway that valerian and chamomile work on, and some laboratory research suggests they may also help support a more natural rhythm to the deeper stages of sleep. though most of that particular finding comes from animal studies rather than large human trials. I'll say it plainly. When you hear, may help support, that means promising, not proven. I'd rather tell you the honest version than the exciting one. What's genuinely interesting is that Hanakiol has drawn attention from researchers well outside sleep medicine entirely, in fields looking at general cellular stress and aging, which is part of why this particular bark has seen a real resurgence of scientific curiosity over the past decade. It's related, distantly, to the magnolia trees plenty of us have growing right in the front yard, though it's a specific Chinese species that's traditionally used medicinally, not just any ornamental variety. If you're sourcing this one, buy it prepared from a reputable herb supplier rather than stripping bark off a tree at the garden center. The bark's tough, so it needs a real simmer, about 15 minutes, covered, not just a steep. Traditional preparations often added a small amount of dried ginger alongside the bark, which both improves the flavor and, according to classical texts, was thought to help the warming quality of the bark carry further through the body. A small piece goes a long way. It's got a warm, almost woody sweet taste. Woody, warm, worth the wait. I need to clear something up right away because the name trips people. California poppy is not opium poppy. Different plant, different family, different chemistry entirely. This one's not narcotic, and it's legal to grow in a garden bed right alongside your tomatoes. Indigenous peoples across California used it traditionally for restlessness and minor discomfort, long before it became the state's official flower in 1903, chosen in part because entire hillsides would turn orange with it every spring. Spanish sailors glimpsing the California coast reportedly called it the Land of Fire, on account of those hillsides, though they were thinking about gold, not sleep, when they named it. The alkaloids in this plant are structurally different from the ones in opium poppy, and research indicates they work mildly on calming receptor systems without the dependency risk associated with opioid compounds. That distinction matters, and I don't want anybody walking away confused about it. Most of the human research here is still preliminary. What we have leans heavily on traditional use, with modern laboratory study just beginning to catch up, mostly out of interest in finding gentler alternatives to stronger sedatives. It's worth noting the whole plant is used here, not an isolated extract, which is typical of traditional indigenous preparation and part of why researchers suspect the calming effect may come from several compounds working together rather than any single one carrying the whole load. It's a generous plant to grow, honestly. Once it's established, it reseeds itself year after year, closing its petals every evening as the light fades, almost like it's demonstrating the whole point of this video on its own schedule. A small blessing, if you ask me, watching something wind down right along with the day, a teaspoon of the dried aerial parts, leaf and petal both, steeped covered for 8 minutes. It's mild, almost grassy, and I usually let it be the last cup of the night after the dishes are done. Once a patch is established, you rarely have to think about it beyond keeping it from crowding out its neighbors, a forgiving plant, which I've always thought suits its purpose well. The easier a plant is to grow and keep, the more likely people are to actually use it, and that's not a small thing when we're talking about building a consistent evening routine. Ashwagandha comes from a different tradition than most everything else on this list. It's a cornerstone of Ayurvedic medicine in India, used for thousands of years, referenced in some of the oldest medical texts we have on record, texts that predate most of Western written history by a wide margin. Its name roughly translates to smell of the horse, on account of both its scent and an old belief that it gave the strength of one. It's classified as an adaptogen, which is just a fancy word for a plant that seems to help your body handle stress a bit more evenly rather than targeting sleep directly. Compounds called with anolides are what researchers focus on. In several modern clinical trials, people taking ashwagandha regularly reported meaningfully better sleep quality and lower stress markers over weeks of use, not just after 1 cup. That's an important distinction. This isn't a plant that knocks you out tonight. It's one that seems to recalibrate things gradually, over time, the way tending a garden bed pays off in the following season rather than the same afternoon. One of the more frequently cited trials followed participants for 2 full months and the improvements in both perceived stress and sleep quality kept building the longer people stayed with it, rather than leveling off after the first week or two. It doesn't grow easily in this climate, I'll be honest with you. It wants heat and a long dry season, so most of what reaches an Oregon kitchen comes dried, from a trusted supplier, rather than off my own land. There's no shame in that. Not every useful plant belongs in every garden. This is the second time tonight I need to be direct with you. Ashwagandha isn't right for everyone. If you have a thyroid condition, an autoimmune disorder, or you're pregnant or nursing, this is a conversation to have with your doctor first, not a habit to start on your own say-so. I mean that. Half a teaspoon of the root powder, or a small handful of dried root pieces simmered 10 minutes. It's earthy, a little bitter. I usually add a touch of milk and honey, the way it's traditionally taken. Reishi isn't a plant at all, it's a mushroom. And in traditional Chinese medicine, it's been called the mushroom of immortality for close to 2,000 years. That's a big title for something that looks, frankly, like a woody little shelf growing out the side of a tree, tough and unassuming until you know its history. Ancient texts describe emperors sending expeditions into the mountains specifically to gather it, treating a wild specimen as something close to treasure. It shows up carved into temple architecture and painted into scrolls, a symbol of long life and good fortune long before anyone thought to study what was actually inside it. That kind of reverence, held across 2,000 years, is exactly the sort of thing that makes a modern researcher sit up and ask what the fuss was really about. The compounds getting attention here are triterpenes and a type of complex sugar called beta-glucans. Here's the honest part, the part I promised you back at the start. Researchers know these compounds interact with the nervous system and with the body's stress response chemistry, but exactly how they nudge someone toward deeper, steadier sleep is still being worked out. It's an active area of study, not a settled one. That kind of honesty matters more to me than a tidy answer that isn't quite true yet. Some of the more compelling early work has looked at how reishi affects the immune system alongside the nervous system, which fits with how it's traditionally been used, not as a single-purpose remedy, but as a general tonic meant to support the whole body at once. These days, most of what's sold as reishi tea comes from cultivated mushrooms grown on hardwood logs or sawdust blocks, rather than wild foraged ones. That's actually good news. Wild reishi can be tricky to identify correctly, and cultivated sources tend to be more consistent besides. Reishi needs a real simmer, 20 minutes at least, sometimes longer. Because it's tough as old leather, a few slices go a long way. It's bitter, genuinely bitter, and I won't pretend otherwise. Most nights I sweeten mine with a spoon of local honey, and I don't feel one bit guilty about it. Tulsi holds a place in Hindu households that goes beyond medicine entirely. It's often grown in a dedicated pot right at the entrance of the home, treated as sacred, tended with a kind of daily reverence most of us reserve for very little in our lives anymore. I find something moving in that. A plant grown not just for what it does, but out of reverence for what it represents. My own faith teaches something similar, that the garden itself is a gift, provided by the Creator, and worth tending with care, even when nobody's watching but the birds. In Ayurvedic tradition, Tulsi is sometimes called the incomparable one, and it's woven so deeply into daily ritual that many households drink a cup each morning as much out of devotion as out of any expectation about what it might do for the body. I like that. A plant that earns its keep on two fronts at once, the spiritual and the physical, without anybody feeling the need to separate the two. Like ashwagandha, Tulsi is classed as an adaptogen. Modern research has looked at how it affects the body's stress hormone response, and several small trials found regular users reported lower stress and better sleep quality over a period of weeks. Again, this is a slow-building plant, not a fast one. There's also traditional use for general immune support, though I'll keep us focused on sleep tonight, since that's what we're here for. What researchers seem to agree on most consistently is Tulsi's effect on the body's stress hormone response, specifically cortisol among them, which is likely the main thread connecting its traditional reputation for calm to what shows up when scientists actually measure it in a lab setting. There are a few different varieties, Rama, Krishna, and Vanatulsi among them, each with a slightly different flavor and a slightly different balance of compounds. Vana Tulsi is the most aromatic of the three, almost like clove crossed with pepper, while Rama is the mildest and easiest to grow in cooler climates. I grow Rama Tulsi myself, mostly because it tolerates our damp Oregon springs better than the others, and because the flavor is gentle enough to drink every evening without getting tired of it. A small handful of fresh leaves, or a teaspoon dried, steeped covered for 5 minutes. Peppery, a little like basil crossed with mint, if that makes any sense at all. God-given, if you ask me, a plant that clears the mind and settles the body both. I know what you're thinking. Catnip. Isn't that the stuff that makes the neighborhood cats go a little wild? It is. And here's the strange part. In humans, it does close to the opposite. Folk healers across Europe used catnip as a calming tea for centuries, right up until hops became the more fashionable choice in the 18th century and mostly pushed it off the shelf. It was even used in earlier generations as a gentle bedtime tea for fussy children, long before anyone had studied why it seemed to work. There's an old English name for it, catmint, that still gets used interchangeably today, and it turns up in herbals dating back to the 16th century, listed right alongside chamomile and lavender as a household staple. Not a curiosity. It only really became known as a cat plant first and a people plant second sometime in the last century, once pet culture caught up to it. The compound responsible, nepetalactone, is the same one that sends cats into a frenzy. But in the human body, the evidence, mostly older and traditional rather than modern clinical, points toward a mild sedative effect instead. Isn't that something? The same molecule, two completely different reactions depending entirely on whose nervous system it's talking to. It's a good reminder, honestly, that a compound's effect isn't fixed in stone. It depends on the receptors it meets, and every creature's wired a little differently underneath the fur or the skin, as the case may be. Modern clinical research on catnip for human sleep is thin. I'll admit that outright. It hasn't drawn the research dollars that Valerian or chamomile have. What keeps it on this list is centuries of consistent traditional use, and the fact that, in my own experience, a mild patch of it in the garden has never gone to waste. A teaspoon of dried leaf and flower, steeped covered for 10 minutes. Mild, almost minty. I grow a patch just for this, well away from where my old barn cat can get at it, or there'd be none left for tea. Oat straw is the green, unripe stalk of the common oat plant, harvested well before it turns to grain. European folk medicine relied on it as what they called a nervine tonic. And honestly, farmers fed the same plant to worn-out horses for a reason. If it settles a plow horse after a long day, there might be something to it for the rest of us, too. It shows up in 19th century farmhouse remedies right alongside chamomile, usually as the everyday tea, the one nobody thought twice about keeping on hand. It never carried the mystique of a rarer import from across an ocean, and maybe that's exactly why it got overlooked for so long. Sometimes the most useful plant is the one growing in the field you drive past every day, not the one that had to travel halfway around the world to reach your cabinet. There's no single flashy compound here the way there is with chamomile or valerian. Oat straw's strength seems to come from a broad mineral content, particularly magnesium and calcium, both of which play a supporting role in how your nervous system winds down at the end of the day. Think of it less like a key in a lock and more like restocking the whole toolbox your body reaches for at bedtime. Research here leans traditional, with modern studies still fairly limited. What modern research there is tends to focus on oat straw extract's effect on cognitive function and mental fatigue during the day, rather than sleep specifically overnight. Though the two are more related than they might first appear, a nervous system that's well supported during the day tends to wind down more easily once evening comes. It's a forgiving plant to grow, too. Oats will fill in a bare patch of garden almost by accident, and you can harvest the green stalk for tea long before you'd ever let it go to seed for grain. Waste very little, use most of it. That's a rule I try to live by out here. A generous handful of the chopped green straw. Simmer gently for 15 minutes. It's mild, faintly sweet, almost like drinking a field. It blends well with chamomile or lemon balm if you want a little more complexity in the cup. My grandmother kept a jar of this on the stove most winters. Or was that her sister? Well, no matter. The point stands either way. Schisandra carries a name in traditional Chinese medicine that translates to the five-flavor fruit because a single berry manages to taste sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and pungent nearly all at once. Practitioners have used it for well over 1,000 years, prized for helping the body find balance rather than pushing it hard in any one direction. It's also grown a following in parts of Russia and Korea, where the vine turns up in traditional folk remedies entirely independent of the Chinese tradition, which is worth pausing on for a moment. In Russia specifically, it earned a reputation among hunters in the far east of the country, who reportedly chewed the dried berries to help them stay alert and steady through long, cold nights in the forest, a use quite different from the calming reputation it holds elsewhere, which is a good reminder that a single plant can mean different things to different people, depending on how and when it's used. Modern researchers classify it as an adaptogen, too, the same broad family as Ashwagandha and Tulsi. Early studies suggest it may support a more balanced stress response over time, which in turn can support more consistent, restful sleep. Though I'll say plainly, Schisandra has less sleep-specific research behind it than several others on this list. Most of what we know leans on centuries of traditional use backed by newer, smaller studies still catching up. Some of the more interesting recent work has looked at Schisandra's effect on liver function specifically, which is a different thread than sleep. But it speaks to the same underlying idea behind every adaptogen on tonight's list: support the body broadly, and better rest tends to follow as one part of a bigger picture. The vine itself is a hardy climber, and it'll take a few years to establish and fruit if you're growing it from scratch. Most of us buy the dried berries instead, which keep well in a sealed jar for a good long while, tucked at the back of the pantry. A small handful of dried berries, lightly crushed, simmered 10 minutes. It's a strange, complicated flavor, and it took me a good while to warm up to it. It's become one of my favorites to end the night with. 15 plants, 15 cups, and not one of them a miracle. Just old, patient, well-used company for the end of a long day. Now, if you've stayed with me this far, you already know none of these 15 are a substitute for a real conversation with your doctor, especially if you're already managing a sleep condition or taking medication for one. What they are is old, patient knowledge, tested for longer than any pill in your cabinet, growing quietly in places most folks stopped looking a long time ago. Some of these, like chamomile and lavender, you can probably start tonight without a second thought. Others, like Valerian and Ashwagandha, deserve a slower approach, a smaller first cup, and a proper conversation with your doctor if you're on any medication at all. That's not me being cautious for the sake of it. That's just how you treat anything with real effect on the body, plant, or pharmacy alike. And if you're already sleeping well most nights, honestly, you may not need any of this. Good rest is the goal here, not a new nightly ritual for its own sake. I'd love to know which one you're going to try first. And here's my real question for you, out at the garden fence. Of the 15 we covered tonight, which do you already have growing somewhere on your property without ever knowing what it was good for? Tell me down in the comments, along with your climate zone if you know it. I read every single one, and I like knowing where you're all writing in from. If this kind of thing is useful to you, consider subscribing. I put a new one of these together most every week, going through what's growing, what the research actually says, and what I'm making with it in my own kitchen. I'd be glad for the company, and I do read every comment, even the ones that just say hello. Until then, take care of that body of yours. Rest well tonight, and God bless.